Shalom, shalom. This is Elder Ephraim, all the way in the Gulf, to drop another biblical nugget and or token for your spiritual edification. Today we're going to be dropping a token pertaining Esther. You know, Esther, it's a book that many choose to denounce because it is said that the name of the Most High is not in that book. And so it's important to understand context as to why it's a valid book to most. If you go to the book of Genesis chapter 12, you'll come across the story when Abraham, out of fear, told his wife Sarah to portray herself as sister rather than spouse amongst Pharaoh. And so in that story, there was a period in which Sarah was in Pharaoh's camp. If you go to Genesis chapter 20, the story is repeated, but this time, instead of Pharaoh's camp, it's now in Abimelech's camp. And again, out of fear, because of her beauty, he wanted to make sure that there was no jealousy, envy against him. So again, he portrayed her to be sister rather than spouse, rather than a wife. And so for a period, as with Pharaoh, we see that she was in Abimelech's camp. If you go several chapters later, if you go to chapter 26, we'll come across the story of Isaac, Abraham's son, who also repeated that same practice, and out of fear, conveyed his wife to be sister in Abimelech's camp. So in both instances, you had Abraham and Isaac who denounced their wife as their spouse and portrayed them as sister out of fear. Now, if you notice those stories, the Most High never corrected those men because those men are the delegated authority in their life. And so if you go to Numbers chapter 30, you'll see where a husband has the authority to usurp the vow over the spouse's life. In the earlier verses of the chapter, you'll see where a father has the same authority over a daughter. So in Numbers chapter 30, verses 2, 3, and 4, it's a father's delegated authority over a daughter, as well as verses 6, 7, and 8, a husband's delegated authority over a wife. And as in those stories where the husband, as the delegated authority, put their wives in compromising position in hands of heathens, the Most High never corrected them for that because that was their authority to do if they chose to do as they did. What's significant about that history is to see that when we come into the story of Esther, Esther's primary responsibility was to deliver the nation under her delegated authority, which was her elder. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 1, an elder is to be entreated like a father. So in her instance, where there was no biological father and or husband, the delegated authority in her life was Mordecai, her cousin. And as her delegated authority, he put her in a position that was contrary to the Israeli culture or to the biblical culture. The same reason Abraham and or Isaac were not corrected for their actions with their spouses. On the contrary, the spouses were protected as the Most High corrected Pharaoh and Abimelech if any violation occurred against them. It's important to understand that Esther was put in the heathen's possession or the king's possession as a spouse for the deliverance of a nation. So Mordecai implemented the same action that they implemented, but while they operated in fear, Mordecai operated in faith, in his authority. And so it's important to understand that when a daughter and or spouse is put in a position by the delegated authority, the Most High is going to keep his hands off of it. And because that's the context of the book of Esther, is why the name of the father is not on it. Because the father did not sanction that, the same way he didn't sanction what happened to Sarah and or Rebecca in Genesis 12, 20, or 26. And so, because the Most High has no respect of person among the nation of Israel, he could not hold Mordecai accountable to an error that Abraham or Isaac were not held to. And so it's important to understand that. And so besides that principle, it's also important to understand the validity or the value an elder has in the life of these sisters when a biological father and or a husband is not valid. Mordecai and Esther's relationship in the book of Esther is a very significant story to emphasize the power of an elder in the life of a sister, such as we saw in the life of Sarah and or Rebecca. So while there are many that denounce that book, I'm just conveying context as to why it's important to validate the book of Esther in the context of what is seen throughout the history of our book. If you notice, while Ruth, the name of the father, is considered mentioned or is mentioned, it's important to understand that even Ruth was never spoken to directly through the father, because the father knows his position when it comes to daughters with delegated authorities in their lives. If you go throughout the book of Ruth, you'll notice that, like in the book of Esther, the father never spoke to the women directly. Never. Why? Because there's always a delegated authority. As far as Ruth is concerned, Ruth's story was to show the validity of Naomi, her mother-in-law, and how the scripture talks about the elder women are to teach the daughters. That's the context. Some people try to run with Ruth, the Boaz and the Ruth story, and they try to emphasize the context of that. But one of the strongest contexts of the book of Ruth is the validity of a mother teaching the younger daughters or the younger women how to be wives and how to take care of the homes and things of such. But getting back to the book of Esther, while the name of the father is not on it, understand that the validity of the book stems from Mordecai being the delegated authority in her life, putting her in a position that contradicts the culture and or the principle of the Israelite culture. And what we do notice in the modern Protestant Bible, which conveys the 10 chapters, is an obedient subordinate to Mordecai. It's important to understand that the other 6 chapters that are considered hidden, it's interesting because in the life of Esther, in the following chapters, so in the book of Esther, it would have been 16 chapters, 10 in the original Bible, and then 6 remaining, so it would be a total of 16 chapters. And in those following chapters, it's interesting how you find the cry of Esther as far as feeling like she feels like disgusted. She feels like ashamed. She feels like she's just in a very distraught manner because she's with a heathen. But what that experience conveys is when Yahushua, Yahushua, or Jesus, when he was on the mountain, he was crying out to the Father, and he was trying to deter what he was getting ready to go through, but he stopped himself and he said, "But not my will, but thy will, Father. Let it be what you so permit." So while he was in a position that he didn't want to be in, he submitted to the position because it was the will of the Father for the context of the totality of the nation of Israel. And so with that same heartbeat, I want you to understand that when Esther's crying out and she's finding that distress in her union with this heathen, which is contrary to our culture, it's important to understand that she just submitted herself, like we see like Yahushua and or Jesus did when he, not wanting to, gave in because it was the will of the Father. And so Esther can be seen in that same light where she knows it's better. She knows she shouldn't be, but because her delegated authority put her in a position, she submitted to it. And so I say that to just pretty much validate and or bring context as to why there are those that do believe in the Book of Esther, specifically in the Hebrew Israelite culture. I trust it was a positive nugget, and I'm looking forward to hear great testimonials pertaining this message. Shalom, shalom. Yah bless.